everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask Me Anything with Gary Wayne. We're very excited to have you, and we appreciate you coming out and spending some time with us on this awesome Monday afternoon. We're just getting started with changing the clocks over here, and it got a little bit dark a little bit early, but I'm still wide awake, and I'm super excited for the questions that we have for Gary tonight. So, Gary, are you still with us, sir?
I am, and very happy to be back with you again tonight, and very much looking forward to the show.
All right, excellent. Well, I just wanted to keep this as a surprise for everyone, but if you were with us last time, you'll know that we're here on camera with you. So, hello, everyone, and it's good to see you all. So, we'll get started with a quick prayer, and then I think that we'll just get straight into it. So, I'll answer one quick question that we had recently. It was, why do you pray on your live streams? Why do you pray in your videos? And I think that it's very important, actually, for the people who are here. We are praying together as a family. And I think it's essential in any time you're doing any type of ministry or trying to seek the truth of the scriptures and trying to beckon the Holy Spirit that you do say a quick prayer. So it's also a chance for us to praise the Most High together. And that's, the greatest joy in our life is being able to praise our Creator together and just worship Him for the salvation that He's brought us. So, if you will, we'll just say a quick prayer. Father Yah, we just humble ourselves and we just lift you above all that we are. We pray that you'll please be with us, be with Gary specifically as he takes on all these questions and speak through him. Please, Father, give him a clear mind to be able to speak the answers that you have and only the real, unadulterated truth, Father. We just want to know the truth, and I know that everyone out there is just seeking to know you better, to understand your creation, to understand their role in the creation. So we just thank you so much for coming into this world and for showing us who you are, that you are love, and that you've loved us greater than anyone could ever love us because you gave your life for us. And we just praise you, Father. Not only did you give us your life, but you also extend us the victory that you have over death. We thank you for extending that promise to us, Father. Through faith in you, we have salvation. We praise you. We thank you for that. And we just lift you up above all that we are, Father, for we are nothing and you are everything. You're the Alpha and the Omega. You're the perfect one. And we praise you. We thank you. In the name of the Messiah, Yahusha, Amen. All right, Gary. So we will go ahead and get started with question number 1. And this question comes from Renata, and she says, regarding the new royal, Meghan Markle, what do you know about this bloodline, and what do you think about the new royal baby? Any thoughts on this child being a future world leader?
It's a really good question, and as with all the members of the royal family, they will play important roles, some greater than others. But to have a significant impact, typically you need to have a position to be able to do that. So let me just explain what I'm talking about that, and then I'll explain where you might see a descendant coming from Harry and Meghan down the road having an impact, possibly. So if you look at who is the queen today, it's Elizabeth, and of course she's in her 90s, and there's going to be a successor to her when she dies. And the first one in line is Prince Charles, and the second one is Charles's son William, and then after that is William's son George, and then his sister Charlotte, and then his youngest son Louis, which puts Harry sort of sixth in line. So I'm not, unless there's some significant sort of bad luck that comes along, some tragic things that would happen within that succession of the Charles lineage down through William, I don't see Harry and Meghan becoming king and queen and then having their newborn being first in line for the throne after that. Now, in terms of Meghan, she, and I haven't done significant research on this, but I've not found any real significant royal bloodlines. There's some loose connections to some of the pseudo blue bloods, like the Bush family and others in North America. There's a 24th generation connection back to King Edward, but nothing that's really sort of significant in terms of extraordinary bloodlines. There's obviously, you can make some connections, and maybe that had something to do with, Harry marrying or being permitted to marry her is probably more accurate. Maybe it had something to do with that, those very, very diluted bloodlines to sort of try and refresh the bloodline. But it could also be that Harry is just so far down on the succession list that it doesn't really matter that much. Now, where where either Harry or one of his offspring could have a connection is in some of the royal societies and secret societies that the Windsor family would be connected to. And one of the most powerful secret societies is the Knights of St. John, that on the Catholic side would answer to Pope Francis as being Pope. But from the Protestant side, and almost not quite as equal, but very close to being equal, you have where the Knights of St. John are located on Malta as being under the sovereignty of England, which brings in the Queen of England. So you could see some sort of crossover of Harry or one of his descendants perhaps going into that organization, because the adept level of the leadership of that organization comes from only from, for the most part, from the bloodlines of the royal families. But typically it's the secondary or third bloodline. So it's not the sort of direct heir to the throne of that bloodline. So you could see them having an impact, perhaps with the Knights of St. John and taking an active role there, just as the Knights of St. John has official sort of status at the UN. They have observation status, they participate, and they are very, very powerful organization, both politically and within the Catholic Church, and within other organizations around the world, working closely with organizations like the CIA and others. So you could see an impact there, but that would be about all I could see. I just can't see how he is going to be one to even have a chance to rise to like being a contender for Antichrist, not having that base and not being sort of the first son. I suppose he could be the one that is asked if he were to sort of gain some sort of political experience in terms of nation to nation negotiation or some sort of track record like that, where the Universal Church will call on him perhaps to negotiate the New World Order covenant for the last 7 years, and that would put him on that rise. But again, it's that pedigree that I'm concerned with that isn't quite as strong as I think Antichrist will be. So I'm not even sort of seeing that in the picture. But my speculation on is not. I don't see a significant role for him unless something changed the family that's quite tragic.
Wow, well, you definitely have quite a bit of information to share. I feel like I need to write all of these names of these organizations down and maybe spend a few years of my life researching what exactly they are. But we really appreciate your answer.
And it would take years too, Justin.
Yeah, I know that we're blessed to have you here with us because you've given those years of research, and we appreciate you summing up all of that big brain of yours and letting us know the answers to these questions. So I'll go ahead and read question number 2. Comes from Tony, and he asked, what is the history of the canon of the Bible? Wow, this is a big question as well. He said, were there 88 books or so as late as the 1800s, and what is the reason those books would be excluded?
Good. It's a very, very good question. And, one of the more contentious issues is at the beginning when they're assembling the initial canon, what were the conditions that they were using to establish whatever number you want to assert on that, and I'll address the 88 and 66 in a couple of minutes. And so one of the criteria that they were doing is they wanted to have, for the most part, a Hebrew manuscript that they could take the original back on. They wanted to be able to authenticate the authorship as to who wrote the book. And they wanted to authenticate that the copy was not corrupted in any sort of ways. And so that takes a few manuscripts to do the comparatives. It needs a line of succession in terms of how those manuscripts came about. And that's how they assembled the original canon. And they also wanted to make sure that those scriptures were congruent with what the other scriptures were saying as one of the other sort of tests. And if it didn't include proclaiming Jesus for the New Testament as the Son of God, the Word of God, the Savior, the Redeemer, and that he was resurrected, then that would have been viewed as corrupted. And so they arrived at two sort of, I'll say three core groups. One would be the 66 books that we would recognize it as today. And then there would have been 22 for the most part of what they would call apocryphal books. And then there would have been some other ones that would be considered apocryphal as well, but less reliable in the initial evaluation and not included in sort of the second circle of the larger book over and above the 66 that they're going to certify. So this is kind of the standard even down through the writing of the Vulgate Bible with Jerome, and you have the 66 books, and then you have an extra 20 odd books that are considered apocryphal, but it's not going to include books like First Enoch or the Jasher one, and many of the other ones that people might be familiar with, like Jubilees. That would be that third sort of set. And even down through Luther's Bible in the 1500s, you have that sort of that structure. So this is something that's being handed down and being built on. And then when the King James translators come along and are going to write the first one that they think that they can take widespread as an English translation, and the one that is going to be sort of the base that most of the Bibles take their translations from, although there's some modern translations now, they established that same sort of number of books. But what happens in starting about 1647 or so, then there's a bunch of pushback as to should the apocryphal books actually be in there. And these apocryphal books that I'm talking about are like First Ezra, Second Ezra, Baruch, Maccabees, Wisdom, Tobit, and all really, really good reading, at least as for context and for a secondary source. And I'll let other people evaluate whether or not they think those books are worthy to be in the canon or not, but they were considered that first set of apocryphal books. But by 1885, all of these books are removed from the original King James Version set of books. And it's for those reasons, is that there are some questions as to the authorship and the authority, the Hebrew manuscript, and the succession to prove that authority, that it's from the original books and there's no corruption. So it's a bit of a convoluted story. I have the extra books, and in my book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, I like to quote books like Wisdom and Tobit and Baruch and other books, and it just sort of fills in a lot of the gaps. And what it really does as well through books like the Maccabees, it starts to give you a history between the two temples of the Second Temple time period. So from after the return of the Jewish people from the diaspora into Babylon right through to the time of the fall of the temple, you get that gap kind of filled in from a Jewish scriptural perspective. And I think it's very, very important to understand that sort of context, to understand what happens at the time of Jesus and then the formation of the Christian church.
Sorry about that. I was getting the next question pulled up. Thank you again for sharing that. And for everyone in the chat, we really appreciate you being here. Uh, Basil Smith said, huge fan here. Love listening to all of your expertise, Gary. We really appreciate everybody's support. MJM, Truth Bites, Zach, everyone, we really appreciate having you here. And the way that these AMAs always go, we have 14 questions from a predetermined list, which are questions that people have sent in previously. And then towards the end of the episode, we will be able to get to some live questions prayerfully. I think that we've been getting through questions pretty quickly tonight, so we should be able to get to everyone's questions. So if you do have any questions, please write them in all capital letters, and I will respond to you and let you know that I got your question, and we'll put it on the list to be answered at the end. But this next question comes from Tony, and he asks, who has the potential to be the Antichrist? And will the Antichrist come first before the rapture?
Two very, very good questions. And again, I'm going to be speculating, and I like everybody to understand when I'm speculating and when I'm not. So when they're trying to understand who Antichrist is going to be, there's a number of different areas where he can come from. And of course, we don't have, a name, but there's some things that we can look at to kind of understand who Antichrist might be. And I guess the first thing that's probably going to be required is that this Antichrist is going to need to be from the tribe of Judah, or at least forged pedigree to prove that he has some Judaic bloodlines, because everybody knows from the Bible that the Messiah comes from the tribe of Judah. So he's going to have some sort of connection either back to from a polytheist scion and grafting in, and a reinventing of Jesus from not dying on the cross and not being the Word of God and having children, either back to Jesus, but certainly back to David and through the Jewish bloodlines to have credibility with the Jewish people, because they're going to buy into this covenant and they're going to be assured of peace and safety, and they're going to be assured of being able to carry out the sacrifices on the temple, on a wing of the temple. And the King James Version says extremity, and you look that up in the Hebrew word and it's going to say a wing or outside or something to that effect. So I think it's going to be connected to whatever temple is being referred to in Daniel. So I think he needs to be Jewish to be credible, or have a false genealogy and a pedigree to take him back to being from the tribe of Judah. I would also look at Daniel 8 and looking at that prophecy of the Greek Empire, and then having Antichrist also coming out of that empire, and that as being, I think, in parallel as with Daniel 7, where you have these 7 empires that rise up, and you have rising out of it in Daniel 7 the end time empire of 10 kings. You have a similar prophecy of 7 in Daniel 8, except that it's limited to the Greek Empire. So it's either an extension of Daniel 7, or it's a parallel account, because you can arrive at 7 both ways. You can arrive at it through, let's say, empires like Rome, and there'll be the same for Daniel 8 in the top half of what I'm going to name, just so that people don't get confused here. So you've got Rome and the end time emperor of Rome, that's 2. You have Greece, then you have Babylon, and then you have Persia, and then you have 2 before that, which is generally perceived as Assyria, which is also included in the prophetic accounts and part of what I call the winds of change in terms of empires in Israel's fate through the curses of the covenant. And you have Egypt before that. So that would give you 7 for the empires, and then Antichrist at the 3.5-year point becomes actually the 8th, as he's called, the 8th empire, or the 8th kingdom. And then in Daniel 7, you have Alexander's initial great empire, that's one, and then it's split into four is five, and then Rome succeeds that, and Rome is part of the extended Greek Empire. Then you have the end time empire, and you arrive at seven again. So I'm kind of looking at, with that sort of geography, that is where I would expect Antichrist to come from, just with how the prophecies work in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, that he seems to come out of that. And that would suggest kind of a Western type of Antichrist. Now, there's going to be a lot of people around the world in terms of groups of people and bloodlines that are also going to be vying for Antichrist. You could get, and in Matthew 24, Jesus tells us about, and also in Mark, he tells us about there'll be more than one Antichrist. So he's telling us to be aware of many Antichrists. And all that means is there's going to be a competition as to who's going to be Antichrist. And it could come from, the dragon bloodlines out of China, with the Li bloodline. And for people who may not be aware of it, the Lis were the official kings of all the dynasties as they come out of the Shah people and the Shah dynasties all through the history of China. And now you have, with the president before, you had a Li, and Xi Pen is actually a Li. And I've got that in a document if people want to see how those bloodlines connect. You also have Yamamoto bloodlines, another offshoot again from the Chinese bloodlines. You've got the Sing dynasty, the Khan dynasties out of India. You've got the bloodlines out of South America and Central America. I won't go through all of them, but there's these bloodlines that all go back to the Nephilim all around the world. But they don't have that Jewish bloodline. So I would lean back to, again, that area, and I would look for them producing a pedigree where they can produce some sort of bloodline that at least goes back to Judah and at least goes back to King David. But I suspect that they're going to falsify the record with Jesus's descendants, as they've kept those records, and try and come up with some evidence that Jesus didn't die on the cross. That's typical Gnosticism. So I would expect that. And it's typical doctrine of the secret societies. It's not true. That part's going to be fake. So that's why I say they may have falsified genealogies to create that pedigree. So I would look for sort of that European, but not to dismiss the North Africa, Middle East, Greece or Rome, or Italy as part of it. But understand that these Western bloodlines will keep at least 3 Antichrist figures on the go all of the time. Now, their faction may not win, and it might be another faction that's a relatively unknown to what that we're of today. But the most popular ones would come out of the Windsor bloodline, with likely William being the most likely candidate to come out of that bloodline. That also goes back to Germany. It's connected back to the Stuarts, which was considered the most ennobled bloodline, the Unicorn dynasty. Also goes back to Germany, back to the Scythian bloodlines, just as Charles is on record for saying that his genealogy goes back to Vlad the Impaler, who was known as Dracula, and the A on Dracul means son of a dragon, and he was also part of the Ordo Draconis, which was put together by the Rosicrucians to put the dragon bloodlines back on the Eastern continental kingships in around 1400, because they were losing ground in that sort of respect in the power struggle. So I would look for the Windsors to be a strong candidate, not necessarily from Harry, as we talked about earlier. I would look at still the more pure branch of the Sinclair or the St. Clair bloodline. I would be looking for that, and that's a very strong bloodline. Even though they don't have the kingship, they still have descendants that still intermarry to keep those bloodlines pure. That actually goes back to a marriage of the Middle Eastern bloodlines that come out, that we've talked about as the Rex Deus bloodlines, and what most people would connect the Rothschilds back to, and some of the other families like Plantagenet and Anjou, which are also families that you might want to keep an eye on, that could put a bloodline through. But the St. Clair bloodline is the St. Clair name, also from France, which comes from the treaty in about 911, 912, for the taking of Normandy away from France in a war by the Norse, the Vikings. And that's the Rollo bloodline that goes back to the bloodlines of the gods of the Norse and the Nephilim of the Norse. So you've got as I say, you've got the Sinclair bloodline that you need to put in there. You would also have, as I said, the Plantagenet, which is an offshoot of the Anjou. And you also have the de Bouillon and the Payon bloodlines that sort of intermix with the Anjou as well, because those all go back to the Merovingian bloodlines. So they're all sort of interconnecting, but you can just see just with those names, you've got a pool of viable ones, but also keep an eye on the Bourbon family, because they are the ones who currently have the King of Jerusalem title that is part of the sort of legacy of who's the most likely candidate from their perspective to be Antichrist. And the reason why they believe that, this is not what I believe, this is what they believe, is that they have the territorial inheritance rights for the city of Jerusalem. And this comes from Joshua giving that area to the tribe of Benjamin, which is another Israelite bloodline, and descending obviously from King Saul is how, again, they'll take that genealogy back, that scion, into all of these other bloodlines that are heavily weighted with the Nephilim bloodlines. And they claim that as their legal inheritance right to Jerusalem. And the first king of Jerusalem is crowned in a small priory on the rock of Zion in Jerusalem amongst the Templars by the Calabrian monks, who are Gnostic a monastic order within Catholicism, just as the Cistercian monks are, and just as the Augustine monks are, and most of the monastic orders, because it goes back to the Essenes, which, again, these bloodlines take their secret society organizational structure from, and part of those Judaic bloodlines that they call the princes of Jerusalem, and that they were married into all these other Jewish and Israelite bloodlines I'm talking about. These are the princes of Jerusalem, is what they like to call them, that the Templars were excavating for, to get that information when they're excavating underneath Jerusalem. And the first king of Jerusalem, as I said, is crowned king of Jerusalem in 1118 at this priory in Sion, where the name Priory of Sion comes from. And this is not a made-up organization, and there's references to them in history. So if you want to just get a hold of me, I'll send you some historical references so that you can establish the veracity that the Priory of Sion is the inner order of the adepts for the Knights Templar. And Baldwin is the brother of de Bouillon, who is one of the main founders of the Knights Templar, and they have bloodlines back to the Merovingians that go back to the Nephilim and all these other bloodlines that I'm talking about. And this King of Jerusalem title will go down through history and becomes quite famous and gets linked to the double cross of Lorraine that is part of King René's legacy and bloodline in history. And he's carrying this Jerusalem title, and that's where he inherits this double cross that comes out of Austria through marriage and succession of this King of Jerusalem title. And they have this double cross representing the two bloodlines, the one from Israel and the one from the giants, the Nephilim. And what's interesting about that is this is the region where the Anjou and de Payan and de Bouillon all lived. And again, I have an interesting 3-part document on this double cross of Lorraine, the bloodlines, the area of Lorraine, and how that intermixes in these bloodlines. If you want to get a hold of me, I'll send that to you, along with probably a companion one, which is called the Knights of the Seraphim, which is the Swedish order that has the same type of emblems and also mixes into this. So where I'm going with this is this goes down through history, and then it's I'll jump forward a little bit more. It goes into the Austrian Empire with the Habsburgs, which is another family, Habsburg Lorraine. That's where that connection comes in, and the title passes on through, and then down to King of Juan Carlos of Spain and his son now Philip, who has that Jerusalem title. And what's important about all of that is they believe that when Antichrist takes Jerusalem, he's going to be crowned in the temple. We would know that as the abomination, to accept his official inheritance as the king of Jerusalem and accept Jerusalem in title back. And so that's why the Templars were there to help get Jerusalem and then to hold Jerusalem. And that's why they started the fall out of favor in 1187 when they lost Jerusalem. So again, a little more history and a little bit lengthier answer than I thought I was going to provide on that. But there's a larger point here is that there are a lot of factions that are fighting for who is going to be Antichrist, and there can only be one. So we want to be very careful not to get out too far over our skis and start pointing at everyone that might look like Antichrist and get discredited. And if we as a group of Christians get so discredited with our false predictions and accusations, nobody's going to believe us just when they need us the most. And Antichrist isn't official Antichrist until he's crowned in Jerusalem, as Second Thessalonians talks about, as Mark and Luke and Matthew talk about, and as Daniel talks about. So we want to be very, very careful with that. But certainly a lot of people that could vie, and they do care because they all want to have power, but their biggest concern is that one of their bloodlines gets control of the whole world. So there's going to be this power shuffle that's always going on. So the second question, if I remember it right, is does the Antichrist come before rapture? For me, that's a yes and no answer. Because he's not officially Antichrist until he is crowned in Jerusalem at the abomination, but he enters the world stage. I think he comes before rapture. And then he negotiates the covenant. And I think Christians will be rightly saying that is Antichrist, but he's not sort of officially Antichrist as Second Thessalonians talks about. And again, I like to put that up against what Jesus said and use Jesus as the authority of that. And so everything falls in place when you start to do that. And I also, from my own personal position, and I know, and this is just from what my research tells me, is that rapture happens after the midpoint. Maybe not that long after, but it happens after the midpoint, which means for sure that Antichrist will come first. So that's why I kind of start off with a yes or no. And if you come from a pre-trib perspective, you're probably just going to be here from where your belief is on that is from the introduction of Antichrist as opposed to official crowning of Antichrist. And after he negotiates the covenant, you would expect to be gone. I hope for that. My research just doesn't show that, and everything fits into a later rapture. But again, I wasn't here to lecture on timing of rapture tonight. But to answer the question, he's going to be around before, and he's going to start to become famous with this covenant that he's trying to negotiate. And so anytime, after that, rapture comes, and then he would be here before, obviously, by that chronology.
Wow, awesome. Well, thank you very much for that extremely thorough answer. I know we said we would get to probably everybody's live questions tonight, but we're going through a PhD level course right now, so everybody buckle up. We're in for a ride. My beloved said, Gary, your brain size is enormous. And when I'm sitting here with you, I feel like you're like a funnel with all those books behind you, and you're just funneling out all this information. I know that's probably just a sliver of the books that you've read, but wow, that's a lot of information that you have to share.
Sometimes, I get on a rant sometimes, and
right.
I'm very passionate, like to get the detail out, and I like to make sure that people have enough surrounding information to know that I'm just not sort of blowing smoke. So
right, absolutely. You're setting the basis for when you take us deeper down the rabbit hole. I understand. Basil Smith said, OMG, I love it when he gets on a roll. Information just keeps coming. All right, so on that note, we'll go straight into the next question and let the information keep rolling. This question comes from Ivy, and they ask, what kind of powers do the fallen angels have versus what they had before they fell? And what kind of powers do they have in these end times?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very, very good question. So I think we have to look at a couple of different buckets here first. So we have angels that are in the abyss, and those would be the impassioned ones, as we would, people who come from my view of understanding the Bible, and from a literal aspect, I understand that the Nephilim are real, and people have heard me mention the name earlier in the show, Nephilim, which are the giants of Genesis 6. And so those impassioned ones would be in jail that violated the laws of creation and created demigods on earth against the laws of creation. They're the ones who go to the abyss. And we learn that from, Jude 1:6, and we learn that from 2 Peter 4. And these are the spirits that Jesus is visiting in 1 Peter 3, and basically saying, hey, once I'm resurrected, your rebellion is officially sealed for failure, and you're going to be going to the lake of fire. But we also have giants that show up after the flood. So I fall into the category where I think there's a second incursion. I think that fits the Bible best, and my second position would be somehow surviving it. But then I got to get a little bit cute with the Bible to kind of make that case. And I know it's a significant parallel polytheist version that they supply, that other giants survived the flood, in a very similar story in most cases as to how Noah survived the flood. But for me, it's just easier and makes more sense from a biblical perspective, because I like to base everything on the Bible, to have a consistent sort of case and understanding. And so if there was a second violation, those angels would have gone to the abyss as well. I leave room that there are other types of angels in the abyss, probably the worst of the ones that were before the flood, or maybe just after the flood again, because I look at Revelation 9 and I look at those very scary scorpion beings that are falling Abaddon, Apollyon out of the abyss. And if I look into what we have for evidence of what those beings are, I go to the Akrababalu and the Gurdabalu, noting a crab is a crab is Hebrew for scorpion. And and again, I've got a great document on this with great pictures attached. If you want the pictures on the Facebook link, it has the pictures of these beings that are exactly what are described in Revelation 9. And these beings in polytheism, where they're created by Tiamat and Sumerian, or in and they're in most of the polytheist religious accounts, they had the power to destroy this world. And they had these powerful weapons that we see coming out in Revelation 9. And these ones would even kill people by the stinging of their tail. But they were created initially to keep the lower gods in polytheism in line. So that might be what you would know as the second tier gods, or the Olympus gods, or the Osiris gods, but they're below the parent gods. And then after their creator Tiamat in the Sumerian lore is somehow killed, which is interesting because immortal beings shouldn't be able to die except in the lake of fire. They're used to protect the sun temples and to protect the ways, portals into the abyss, or the underground where the abyss is located. So when I look at what's coming out of the abyss, there's some really awful ones in there as well, coming out with Abaddon, who I think is Azazel. So what I'm saying with all of this is that not all the angels who rebelled were put in the abyss. And so they're around after the flood, and they're still exerting influence on the earth. And I think these are the angels that are described in Psalm 82 with the gods and the council of the gods and the 70 gods that rule the earth, both before the flood and after the flood. And they're counted as the numbers of the nations coming out of Noah, and or the numbers of Israel that were born in Egypt, which were 70. And so we understand from that that's an equal number, not that Israel was there before the flood when the 70 nations were divided amongst these governors or seraphim angels or the watchers and or the angels of Genesis 6. And we also would expect there was a hierarchy below them that would divide those areas up as well. And so after the flood, they also have this council and be a council of 70 again after the flood. And that's because Satan still has authority over the earth, who these fallen angels report to. And so he's still above it, but you have these at least 70 districts that are separated by other fallen angels. Now, do they have the same power? I would suggest they have power, but maybe not quite the full power. And I think if we look at Satan as being degraded, he still has a lot of power, but he's not yet able to muster this rebellion that he had done before. And he is degraded to Satan status. And we also have other angels described, let's say in Isaiah 13 or Isaiah 34, and other passages that will link back in as these kind of satyr gods, which are these goat gods. And I think these goat gods are a degraded form from the watchers, who I think were seraphim angels, who are the governors, and the same as the watchers that are described in Daniel 4. And they lost that seraphim sort of status, and now they're down to goat god status, just as Azazel, who is part of the watchers and the seraphim watchers of first Enoch, as he's listed, is also depicted as a goat god. And so I think that's reflecting this degraded status. So does that mean they also have a degraded power level? Perhaps. But we also have to remember, though, that in the end time, they're still going to rise up and have war in heaven after Azazel is released from the abyss with all of these other angels that are in there as well. So I think their power is limited, even though they may still have the power. And I think what they're under, and this is my speculation, is that if they go farther than what they're permitted from the flood forward, then they too would go to the abyss until the end time. And I think that's what prevents them from exercising their power, because they do mount this great war in the end time. So either the angels coming out of the abyss bring some sort of power or extra knowledge or something to be able to quickly elevate it to a level to mount that war. I don't think that's the case. I think they're just restricted, and they're not going back to, they don't want to go to the abyss until until after the end time. And they've also are aware of Jesus being resurrected, so they know their rebellion is actually completely over. So what they're really focusing on is just trying to lead more astray. So I know that's a bit of a convoluted, long answer, but the short version is that they may have it restricted, but I think it might be more self-imposed restricted, so that they won't go to the abyss, and that they remain outside until the last time that they possibly can stay out. And at the end of the rebellion, at the end of the last 7 years, they're going into the lake of fire, as Jesus described in Matthew, is reserved for them.
Amen. Thank you again for that very thorough answer. I'll go ahead and bring up the next question that comes from Autumn. She says, Gary, when did you get saved? And do you have a personal testimony to share? That's a great question. I'm excited to hear this one.
It generally is. And so mine was kind of a path before being saved. And so I grew up in a couple of churches with my family, Protestant churches. And by the time I got into high school and the brainwashing was kicking in with secular education and peer pressure and everything, I had left the faith. And so I had basically become a flag waving evolutionist and science and we can do anything type of thing. But what happened is when I was about 21, my brother and a friend had come over one night, and we were having some beers and just shooting the breeze. And late on in the evening, one of them says to me, we want to know whether or not you have enough courage to read a book. And I said, probably. And they said, well, you got to be sure. And I said, yeah, I mean, I'm not afraid of anything, I don't think. So why would I be afraid to read a book? What's the name of the book? And they said, once you read it, you're probably not going to look at things the same again. And it's a scary, scary book. And so the name of the book was called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And I have a number of his books still up on the shelves, and I was buying every book I could read after I read the first one, and it literally scared the socks off me. But not to the point where I was ready to convert back and reaccept Jesus as my Savior and God as my God, and the Bible as the Holy Word of God. But what I did was I wanted to verify what Hal was writing about. Was it out of context? Was it accurate? Because I kind of had a negative sort of perspective of so many organizations that are called Christian that would manipulate the Bible and exaggerate things and mislead people and try and take money from them. So the only way of doing it was to go through and try and verify those passages. And lo and behold, I found he wasn't really trying to falsify anything. In fact, he was way ahead of his time. He didn't have everything quite right, but his direction stands up to even today in a great part. Maybe not quite the timing, but he directionally had it nailed as far as I was concerned, at least at that time. And so that led me to say, I want to file and document and follow the chronology of all the different prophecy narratives and any other thing that I find of interest that I come across when I do this. So I started to do it. I had to start over a few times because there's just so many different things, and I had to set up a better filing system and things like that, because you run out of colors just with a color code. So I had to go to handwriting and filing and putting everything in different files. Like, this was in the 80s, so I didn't even have a computer to work on back then. And by the time I get to the New Testament in terms of really studying and researching and logging, and by the time I get through the 4 Gospels, something strikes me is that these words that Jesus is speaking are so powerful, are so far-reaching, are so above what anything I had read before by anybody else in so many different ways, that these to me could not be just a human being talking from human wisdom, and that everything that he was saying and what they said about him and the other Gospels, what they said about him, had to be true. So that was my point when I was coming to that conclusion that I needed to, but even so, I was still quite rebellious, and it took me a while to wrestle that within me to sort of say, wait a minute, you can't be lukewarm here. You have to make your choice. And that's what I did.
Wow, that was a very powerful testimony. We really appreciate it, and it's just so interesting. Everybody has a testimony, but to see that you went through this phase of like falling away, and to know that now you're sitting here as a scholar who is completely devoted to researching the
And
truth of the Most High. For me, I feel like my generation is so
and I
fallen
didn't
away.
and I was quite resistant to come back, and that's
Right,
the other thing, right?
right.
So, but now it's my passion.
You
So,
were receiving the same type of indoctrination that my generation is receiving, and it feels so hopeless sometimes when you try to share with your atheist friends or family, or the people that you know who are just so far down and thinking that everything that the science teachers say is correct. But to know that I share the same type of faith. I was an atheist for 19 years, and I came out of that lifestyle simply because I wanted to know the truth. And when you really search for it, I believe like you really searched for it, you come to know that, wow, the Messiah is true. When you read those words, like you said, it's like, wow, it's just so pure. His words are love. He is love. It's so amazing that to see your testimony. So thank you again for sharing that. I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. We have about 8 minutes till we take a quick break. But this one comes from Think Good Thoughts. And it says, did the early Hebrews in Jerusalem study the stars?
Yeah, I think so. What we do know is right from, and I'll take this back to Eden, is that Adam and Eve were agrarians, and their descendants were agrarians. And when we get into Noah, he's the man of the soil. And what we know about Israel is that they were significant agrarians in terms of not only raising sheep and goats, and but also planting grains, and the amount of vines and grapes and fig trees and things. And they literally created a new Garden of Eden in the covenant land before it was pillaged by war and them being taken out of the land of the covenant. And we're starting to see that reblossom again. So the reason why that's important to understand is that if you're going to be a significant agrarian civilization, you have to be able to follow the seasons. And you have to know when to plant and when not to plant, how to set your calendar. And again, they worked on the lunar calendar. So that means they had to be working with astronomy and astronomy knowledge of a fairly sophisticated level to be able to do these things and to be able to track and keep record of it. So I think they did study the stars. I don't believe that astrology was part of their core application of studying the stars. I think astrology is a perversion of astronomy and is polytheism. And obviously you get references in the Old Testament, as in Isaiah, about the astrologers and prognosticators and all of these different polytheist religions. They would have been surrounded and had some influence by that. But the Jewish people weren't doing astrology from a core religion perspective, just more as a corruption that may have entered in. So yes, they would have followed the stars, and they would have been quite, I think, not qualified, but quite, let's say experts at that knowledge, just so that they could ensure that they could feed their people. It was just a sort of a requirement.
Right on. There is this old book, I think it's from the late 1800s or early 1900s. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. I think it was called The Witness of the Stars by E.A. Bullinger. Have you heard of that one?
Not familiar with that book, no.
No, it's a very beautiful book that talks about how, the Hebrews had the original astrology that was given to Adam and Eve, and how it actually paints the portrait of the Messiah and the story of the biblical narrative in the stars. But they go back and they go into the Hebrew of all the names of the constellations and things like that, and give explanation of how all of that ties together. But that was a really interesting book.
So it's a good point, because when you get into the Kabbalist aspect, that's where you would have that sort of entrance into the Jewish psyche, but it would not be part of the main core. And Kabbalism seems to come about mostly after being in Babylon, where they would have learned and seeing a lot more of it, and it seems to come back. Now, the Essenes were polytheists, but that was more from the Egyptian side, and they don't seem to be quite into the same type of astrology as the the Babylon nations, or the Chaldean nations, or their offspring nations after that.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. So it's 8:56. I think that we can go ahead and take a break before we get into the next question. So thank you everybody again for joining us. Gary, if you don't mind, we'll cut you a quick break and show our trailer for the conference that you're going to be joining us at.
Yep.
All right.
Terrific.
Sacred Word Revealed comes to Atlanta, Georgia on March 27th through 29th, 2020. Purposed to reveal end times mysteries, to prepare the final generation, we must don the full armor of God. Featuring Zen Garcia, Gary Wayne, Stephen and Jana Ben-noon, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, Justin James Garcia, Dr. Joye Pugh, Rob Skiba, Laurel Austin, buy your tickets now at sacredwordrevealed.com.
All right, so you can get your tickets for the Sacred Word Revealed conference that's going to be happening in March 27th to 29th, 2020. It's going to be an awesome conference, and I think we have about 2 weeks left of the early bird tickets. So if you get your tickets now, you're going to have a $50 discount rather than if you get it after the 17th of November. So we do have a really awesome lineup of speakers, and Joy and I have been working really hard to prepare the schedule and ensure that all of the speakers get at least 2 times where they're going to be speaking throughout the weekend. And there's going to be a couple of roundtables, so we're going to have some awesome discussion. We're always going to be available in between speaking and at the nighttime when we're staying at the hotel to fellowship and to really just praise with all of you and to get to know all of you. And that's probably my favorite part of doing conferences, is just seeing all of our friends and our family that Joy and I and Zen, we meet. And we're actually getting ready to go to another conference here in about a week, about 10 days. It's the Flat Earth International Conference in Dallas, Texas. So if you're going to be there, please stop by our booth and say hello. I believe Zen is going to be talking on Sunday morning. So look forward to that, and we look forward to fellowshipping with you all. I also wanted to remind everybody that we do our Digital Readers Club meetings every Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and that live streams on the Zen Garcia YouTube channel. And this last weekend was our first reading from the Great Commission 3, the End Times Apocalypses. And we read through the Coptic version of the Apocalypse of Elijah. And we read through the first 4 chapters. It was awesome. It actually talks a ton about what we spoke of today, talking about the Antichrist, what Gary was talking about. And it talks about the Assyrian and gives a lot of precepts that are found throughout Isaiah and Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the book of Revelation. And it's just a really interesting read. And this coming weekend, we're going to be going through the Hebrew version of the Apocalypse of Elijah. So we'll be able to cover both sides and see cross references of the story. It's a very interesting text that actually a lot of the early church fathers, they believed that Paul quoted from. So it's been a fun read. It's been a very exciting time, and I hope that you'll join us. You can find out more. I'll leave a link in the description box of this video so that you can join us for our studies. Lastly, I want to talk about just real quickly a book that I'm getting ready to release. It's called The Word of the Lord. It's a comparative analysis of the hidden memra. And memra is Aramaic for word, or in Greek it's logos, and in Hebrew it's deber. And it's actually a comparison between the King James Version of our Bible and the Aramaic Targum of the Pentateuch, which is the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, and the book of Psalms. So I take both of the ancient manuscripts and I put it side by side. And what's really interesting, I just take the quotes from the Aramaic Targum where the word of the Lord is mentioned, where it's mentioned hundreds of times more than the Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint, where we get our KJV from. So I put the text where the word of the Lord appears side by side so that you can read and get a more original understanding of what the word of the Lord is and the role that the word of the Lord plays throughout the Torah. And it's a really awesome study. And I believe, there's been a war to hide who the Messiah is and his role throughout creation. And we know that in the beginning was the Word. And it's written in Psalms 33:6, I think, that the heavens were made by the Word. The Word of the Lord made the heavens, and He made all of their hosts. And He truly did. And it's really an awesome opportunity for me to just present some of the work that I've been working on. So thank you for your time, and I think we'll go ahead and welcome Gary back. Are you still there with us?
I am, and congrats on your book, and I'm sure it's a wonderful read. I'm going to have to get my hands on that book.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'll definitely have you a copy when you get to our conference. So
Terrific.
Speaking of the books that we've been working on, can you let everyone know where to find your book?
So if you're trying to get a hold of me or get a copy of my book, the best way of doing that is through my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on the website, you can get a signed copy of my book. You can also read a generous excerpt on all 98 chapters to get a good feel for the book. You can also link into a Kindle format if you want a digital copy, or you can link over and buy from Amazon or from Barnes and Noble. So that's the best way to get a hold of me. And or if it's not on your local bookstore, it's distributed by Bookmasters, so they can order the book in. So it's quite readily available. And but again, if you want a signed copy, for sure through the website.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started with the next question. We only have an hour left, and I think we still have over half of our questions left. So that's fine. We can always take it till next time. But we will try to preserve at least 10 minutes at the end of the episode for all of the live questions that have come through. So this question comes from Scott, and he says, what does Daniel 7:25 mean about the enemy having the ability to change times?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think he's referring to Daniel 7:25, and in the King James Version it says something to the effect that he's going to think to change the time and the laws, and that's the only one that sort of comes to mind for me in terms of that verse. So if there's another one, maybe somebody in the chat room put it up, but I don't recall another one. And it's about the time of the Antichrist, and he's going to be doing all this blasphemy and speaking very arrogantly, and he's going to try to think to change the times and the laws. And if you take the word think back to Hebrew, it actually means hope. So he wants to change the times, and what he's trying to do by changing the times, he wants to change the end, and he's going to deceive people when the end time is, and that's such a significant piece of information for those who are going to be here at that time, that this is how the deceive is the elect is deceived, if that were possible, and they are deceived in Jesus' words, so they will be deceived in a way that is not really kind of expected. But what we do know is 2 Thessalonians 2 in verse 3, it talks about Jesus' time is not coming until after the abomination takes place, and do not be deceived by that. So he's saying that for a reason, and he says that in Matthew 25 as well. Like, do not be deceived by what Antichrist is going to say and do, because they're going to bring out their full toolbox of deceptions, or magic bag, or whatever. Satan is going to support them, and all the fallen angels are going to support Antichrist with all of their power to deceive the people on the earth. And so the reason why it's important is because, and I think I mentioned this earlier in the show, is that he's going to promise peace. And people think that that is part of the negotiating of the covenant. I think that is also part of it, but it's not the main part. So what happens is, not only does he need to have credentials, as what we talked about earlier in terms of his pedigree for being Messiah, understanding he's the false Messiah, he needs to counterfeit everything. This means he needs to counterfeit Armageddon. And so when we look at the timing of Revelation 9, that comes just before the 3.5-year midpoint in Revelations, this has enclosed in it this 200 million man war. This is Joel 1 and 2, has the same type of creatures that are in there that are doing the fighting, and I think those are highly technological and biological war weapons. So I think we're going to see all sorts of strange beasts that had DNA manipulation, implants, whatever they need to do to make those things into those creatures that we see described in Joel 1 and 2 and Revelation 9. And this is the Gog War. And Armageddon happens in Joel 3 and 4. It happens after the Gog War, because that's it happens before the second Exodus. And everything sort of lines up that this is going to look like Armageddon. This is the war that he is going to take credit for winning. This is the war that he's going to step up for and at least do something in the fighting against the revolt of the 10 kings, which is led by Gog and Magog, and all these other countries that are with them, that they're not happy with what is going on in the world in this covenant, and he is going to do something to take credit for winning that war, and then institutes in Jerusalem him as the king, and he's going to say, this is the peace. And so what I think Daniel 7 is telling us is that that's how he's going to bring about this deception to deceive people that the times have changed, and that he is the true Messiah, and that when he is crowned king, that's when the false millennium starts. And that's the time he's trying to change with that deception, and then fight the battle with the help of the fallen angels, who are also thrown out of heaven along with Satan down to the earth at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And I think that's what is being talked about there. He wants to, he hopes to, and he brings about the deception. And the war is so awful that people can't imagine Armageddon to follow after something like that. That it has to be Armageddon when it's not.
Wow, that's a very interesting viewpoint, and we appreciate you sharing it with us. I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. It comes from 12 Ounce Pound. Do you have any knowledge about Haile Selassie, Rastafarian history, and biblical connections?
Yeah, you kind of cut out there, so I wasn't sure that you were finished. Sorry for the hesitation.
Oh, sorry about that.
So who Haile Selassie is?
Right.
He was a Ethiopian king that sort of took on this, larger than life position as to who he was viewed as. And we still see some of these ramifications with the Rastafarians, who, is kind of a religion that almost comes up around who they claim Selassie to be. And he was raised up to be like a Messiah type figure, so an Antichrist type figure. This is going to tie back into kind of what we were talking about earlier in the show in a lot of the ways. And that the Rastafarians are basically kind of the belief system that they are the lost Israelites from the dispersion of the Israelites. And they're the black people. And I don't think that they can, make a good scriptural case for that, even though there may be some lost Israelites among them because they're scattered to the four corners of the earth, but they're certainly not this complete collection of the lost Israelites. But what's interesting about Ethiopia is that, you have this relation with Queen of Sheba and Solomon, and you also have, the Keber Nagast, and you have this heavy sort of Jewish society that comes out of Ethiopia that is still, considers themselves part of the Jewish people, and a lot of them actually have moved back to Jerusalem, to Israel as we know it today. But there's also other groups that sort of grow up around that in more of a cult-like, which is the Rastafarians, in my opinion, would be more cult-like than the ones more loyal to the traditional monotheism of Judaism. And so they believe that Haile Selassie comes out of this bloodline from Solomon. That goes back to David. And that he was this Messianic type figure. And what's interesting about that is that he adopted, his family adopted this double cross symbol that we've talked about with the kings of Jerusalem, with having the bloodlines of that Judaic bloodline and then that Nephilim bloodline. And that this is a royal bloodline, and again, is a bloodline that would have been older than what was scioned in to somehow of having a relationship with Solomon and producing a bloodline from there. But the bloodline that would go back before the Queen of Sheba, she would be of the bloodline that would go back to Nephilim, and in this case, Black Nephilim. So that's sort of how that bloodline and that Messianic figure sort of all comes about. And so they have, even in some of their imagery, they also have this IHS cross figure as for the Jesuit thing, which again sort of links back into the secret societies. And so he is part of these bloodlines that we need to be aware of that will be claiming sort of Antichrist status. And this was just another case where they had raised somebody who has these genealogies and they keep that pedigree to present for the end time as being a rival Antichrist type figure. And so just again, I couldn't think of a better example to come along in the same set of questions for what I was talking about, that you're going to have a worldwide set of Antichrist type figures. And when I say that, I'm talking about you're going to have coming out of India, whether or not it's from the Khan line or the Singh line that I mentioned, or another royal bloodline, because there's several royal houses that come out of ancient India. They do believe in the new Buddha concept, which is a Messiah type contract, and it's more of an incarnation of one of the gods of their pantheon that is sent to help people on the way, as they like to call it, to godhood, just as a claim that Jesus was talking about the same way, but they're two different concepts. They just graft it with that counterfeit sort of aspect. So that's name is what people might be familiar with. They also allegorically call this coming figure Lord Maitreya. We also have the Mahdi out of the Shia sect of Islam, that they're expecting a Messiah type figure there. So you're going to see this come up in a lot of different areas, and it's going to get confusing. So be patient. Don't get caught into this stuff, but be aware that this is a very, very widespread belief and plot and planning that goes into it to present their possible Antichrist figures at the right time with the pedigrees.
Excellent. We really appreciate your answer. And 12 ounce pound is actually in the chat, and he says, thanks, Gary. Awesome depth, as expected. Much appreciated. So, yeah, we really appreciate you. I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. Comes from Scott, and he says, Gary, do you think the planet Saturn is the fallen archangel Satan and Venus is the fallen archangel Lucifer?
It's a really good question, and there's a couple different phases to answering that. So if we understand that Satan is the author of polytheism along with his rebellious angels, and that they make up the pantheon of gods, then we can start to understand where some of these fallen angels might fit in and where Satan fits in and where some of these things sort of come about. And so if I look at different pantheons around the world, let's say if you look at Greece, the god associated with Saturn would be Kronos. And in Rome, they're called Saturn, and they're basically the same pantheon. Saturn is basically Kronos. And in Egypt, it's Jeb. And in Sumeria, it's Anu. And in Canaan, it was El. These were called parent gods. And there's more than one set of parent god, or one parent god, but each of these individuals that I'm talking about is quite similar to who Satan seems to be in terms of I understand it. And then I would slide in the other angels like, Azazel and all the other ones that rebelled in that magic number of 7 that fall in underneath, whether it's a Sabeti or Shebtiyu or the first 7 gods of Olympus before you start adding in, like Zeus's offspring to bring the number to a higher number. You have that magic number of 7 underneath, which is, again, what's talked about in First Enoch. So you have some commonalities there. And in that, you understand that planets are assigned in polytheism to particular fallen angels. They would call them gods. But Venus is not ever assigned to Satan. And so I'm going to come back around on that as we talk about this Lucifer aspect of it. But what we do know is, again, whether it's in Greece, Venus would be a female goddess, which is Aphrodite, that is associated and called Venus again in Rome. And in Egypt, it would be Sekhmet or Hathor. Inanna and Sumeria, in around that area, you have other names that you could slide in that are equal to Inanna, different pantheons, but same goddess. And then Astarte in Canaan. So typically Venus is kind of like that mother goddess sort of aspect of it, but related back towards the parent god that would create the lower gods between their union. So when we look at Satan and Venus, is we get this connection because of Isaiah 14 in the Bible, 14:12, where you have in the King James Version Bibles where it says, Lucifer is the son of the morning. And I think that's a bad translation. In fact, Lucifer is an Italian word inserted for a Hebrew word into the English language, which makes no sense to me. But Lucifer is Latin for Venus. But Lucifer is the name that the secret societies like to call their god, and also the great architect of the universe, and or Lucifer. They use them interchangeably. So I'd be very, very careful. I prefer to call him Halel, which is the Hebrew word Halel ben Shakar, Halel, son of the morning. And it's not that he's the morning star, it's just that he's called son of the morning. And typically the morning star for or the morning planet, which looks like a star for 6 months of the year, is Venus. And for the other 6 months, it's a twilight star. So it comes before the dusk. So when we look at this connection of Lucifer to Venus, it's more of an allegorical thing that is put on by polytheism. onto Satan. And so Venus is a clever allegory, also like a double entendre allegory, representing light, just as Satan masquerades as an angel of light, as it's talked about in the Bible. And so Lucifer is Latin for Venus, and it's the orbit of Venus is where this allegory and polytheist misdirection gets laid on here, I think. So the orbit of Venus, when it's placed against the backdrop of astrology, which you would know in this case to be the zodiac coming out of astrology, forms a five-pointed star or pentagram as it does its orbit through celestial procession. And Satan is also, and Venus is also sort of related to the dog petal, five-petal rose in Freemasonry, because the Venus orbit matches up with the points of the star as it falls between the petals. And it is also this pentagram elliptical rose figure that's on the ceilings of Masonic temples, all reflecting their belief in Lucifer as the great architect of the universe. And they also like to overlay that even onto the apple, which is where I think the source of the apple being the fruit of the tree of Gnosis, or the tree of God, good and evil, as we would know in the Bible, but they like to call it the tree of Gnosis because the apple is the fruit of Venus in their belief system. And it is, when it's halved, it portrays the orbit of Venus and a five-pointed star that's pinpointed by the position of the pips. So all of this is, to me, is like polytheist propaganda overlaid onto Satan. And I don't believe Satan and Halel in Isaiah 14 are two different individuals. And because whether I look at Isaiah 14 or I look at Ezekiel, where it's talked about Satan again as being the cherubim in Ezekiel 28, I look at what Jesus said first, and what he says is he saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. And I think that connects both Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, because I use Jesus as the authority on all those types of things. So I think when we look at Satan, I think he is likely in polytheism assigned to, which he is, he's assigned to the planet Saturn, but I don't believe that is the actual layout as set down by God. I think it's that counterfeit overlay on everything that they do.
Thank you. I don't understand how you have all of this information just ready to present. Like, it's just really crazy how much you present to us.
Well, it's also interesting.
Astronomy and history.
It just hit me in. Yeah, there's a god in the Kishimaya Popol Vuh holy book, and he's called the Vakub Kekwix, and who is associated with Venus, and he carries the sun on his back in the morning as the first star that comes out. And he's very much described in a similar fashion to what Satan is, including his fall and all the jewels and everything around him. So there is this association with him and Venus, but that's not his planet. That's just the allegorical sort of overlay onto this one particular god. Fallen angel is probably a better way of saying that.
Got it. Thank you very much. And for everyone in the chat, I'm sorry, I'm still learning how to moderate the chat, and I'm in need of some moderators. So if anybody wants to volunteer, please let me know, and I can give you access so that we can try to purge the trolls from trolling the chat. But I apologize on behalf of everyone that is trolling, and I'm sorry that you have to see all of the negativity that's been going on. But I appreciate you, Flat Earth and Cleary, Christy, The End. Thank you for trying to keep the peace, and much love to you all. And sorry for the interruption, Gary, but I just wanted to give some attention to everyone that's in the chat. We really appreciate having you tonight. So our next question comes from MJM. And they say, Gary, per your previous shows, you state that modern humanity consists of a combination of day 6 creation, followed by Adam and Eve, and you have placed this at around 6,000 years ago. Does the war in heaven go back way before this timeline? For instance, the Sumerian kings list goes back over 400,000 years. So wouldn't this time frame better reflect when this war actually occurred?
So it's a really good question. So, and just to sort of clearly recap how I view Genesis, I view it in a couple different sections. So, what I take back 6,000 years is only the genealogies to Adam and Eve, and we get that time frame based on those genealogies. I also look at day 6 as being a different creation account than what happened in the Garden of Eden because I can't reconcile it. And there's just so many differences between it. And I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself, but I can't reconcile it. So when I look at that, and then I look at what happens to Cain, I think there's two different creations that are going on, and all of a sudden everything sort of falls in line. So there's a gap somewhere between, day 6 and day 7 and Adam, and we don't know how long those gaps are. But it doesn't account for what MJM is talking about with the 400,000 years. So I'm a bit firm on my position that I think there has to be two different creation accounts there. And again, I think, with God breathing into Adam and putting in the spirit into Adam, this is, helps with what's going to happen in terms of being reborn as a Christian and the resurrection and being able to be taken back into God's kingdom as part of a resolution to the angelic rebellion, which is partially what this question is being framed around. What I'm not as dogmatic on, because I think there's two different ways of translating Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, was the original universe created on day 1, or is there a gap there, as Psalm 104:30 would talk about? When God sends his spirit, he renews the earth, just as we have the spirit in Genesis 1:1-2, Genesis 1 verse 2, with the spirit hovering over the earth, and then we get this renewal of the earth that's going on. And I won't go through the complete oration in terms of all the different things that you could look at the original Hebrew and say that the earth became void and formless, and that the world wouldn't have been created in vain, as Isaiah 45 talks about, which is the same Hebrew words that is being used in Genesis for void and formless, that the earth was designed to be lived in. I think there's a good possibility that we have a gap there, that at some point in time during after the heavens and the earth and the universe is created, something happens to the earth. And I think if you look at when the angelic rebellion happens, that you can make a very good case for the timing seems to fit better to having there, and that rebellion and the destruction thereof accounts for how the world would become void and formless. So I'm open to both translations. I lean towards a renewal of the earth and a gap in there. And with that, then I'm not as inclined to dismiss some of the greater ages that are involved in, like the Sumerian kings list, or some of the accounts of the timelines in Egyptian mythology and religions, and or when dinosaurs might have been around, because again, these are feathered reptilians, which is very much similar to a feathered serpent or a plumed serpent or a seraphim angel. And we just now are learning in the last couple of decades that the dinosaurs, most of them seemingly had feathers. And so they would have been like a being after the seraphim angels, and may have been part of also another corruption that was going on. And so I won't go on this in forever on this, but I think you can make a good case that the world is older than 6,000 years. The only thing we know for sure is the genealogy that goes back to Adam and Eve is about 6,000 years.
Awesome. Thank you for that very thorough answer. I'll go ahead and get moved on to our 11th question of tonight. And it is also from MJM, I believe. They say, if modern humanity is a combination of day 6 creation and Adam and Eve descendants going back only 6,000 years, then how do we explain the skeletons that have been found of earlier versions of man going back many thousands of years? Were these other groups of people also creations of Yah, or were they DNA experiments by the rebel angels prior to creation of modern humanity? So I think you touched on a little bit of this, but they add a little twist to the question.
Yeah, I think I think my answer covers a lot of that. And I also mentioned earlier in the show that somewhere Satan and the fallen angels gain authority over the earth. I think that's part of the corruption of, Earth 1 and Earth 2, if you want to look at it that way. And that these other things that they were doing at the time of the rebellion, would have been just part of what was, going on as violations, just as they, do violations again, starting in Genesis 6 and, destroying that epoch as well that God brings about, the flood to start anew. So I think, pretty much the same answer I gave for that, but that would also, again, say that there was all these other kinds of beings created before the Adamite type of being that's created for a whole different commission in Eden.
All right, awesome. Thank you for that clarification, and I'm sure that MJM appreciates your answer. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. In Genesis 47:28 through chapter 50, verse 26, what's with the promise that Joseph makes to Jacob? It's an oath that he will bury his father Jacob in the cave of Machpelah. Why, if we don't need our flesh and bones after death, was this promise so important? Do we know where Joseph's bones went? And what can we learn from this move of their bones regarding our own afterlife handling of our bodies?
Well, I think what is going on here is, and it gets backed up in the Exodus, that those bones are taken back to Israel in the Exodus, and I'm trying to remember the actual location that they're talking about, and it's eluding me right now. But this is an area where so many important things that happen in the Promised Land. It's where Jacob's ladder is. It's where one of the oaths for the covenant of Israel is taken. And there's a whole series of events. It's one of those most sort of holy events or most holy sites in Israel, just based on the history that's going back there. And of course, when you look at the creation of Israel and the fight that his sons have against the Hivim, who are Nephilim, who are taking advantage of some of the women of Israel. This is the creation of Israel. This is, one of the areas where Israel starts to grow up before they go, off to Egypt because of the events and the drought and everything that happens. And Joseph ends up there before and brings them in and saves them, and they're raised in Egypt before going back for 100 years afterwards in Exodus. So I don't know that I would take anything out of that in terms of spiritually, in terms of what we're doing with the bones, in terms of preserving them. I get a little bit sort of concerned about that. I know it was Jewish tradition to put bones in ossuaries and preserve them and things like that, but I get a little bit concerned if that is used for any sort of worship or trying to converse with people or anything like that. And I'm not quite convinced that that's the case. I think it's just that area was just so important to Jacob that he just wanted to be buried there because of everything that happened in his life. And I don't think it has anything to do with worship. And I know in the Catholic Church, you have this tradition that comes down, and I think it might even extend out of that, where they preserve bones and skeletons of saints, and that starts to get in between into worship. And that's where I get really concerned with in terms of trying to extrapolate anything from that.
Right on. Thank you very much for that answer. I'm pretty sure too, when they asked where did Joseph's bones go, like do we know where they are today? I think there's this place in Hebron, Israel, called the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and I'm fairly certain you can still visit it today. It's in the Palestinian territory, but it's under the control of the IDF, like a lot of places in Palestine. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that you can go there and see Abraham and Sarah's tomb. Are you familiar with that, Gary?
No, I'm not. No.
No. Okay, it is a very cool thing. That's one of the things I'm interested in, is the archaeology of Israel. So anyways, we'll move on to our 13th question, and then we'll have one more before we get into the live questions. This one comes from Vahid. She says, Gary, can you discuss yoga and why it is or isn't bad for a believer to engage in? If it is not something that a believer should be doing, can you explain why not? By what mechanism are we reaching into something that we have no business reaching into?
Yoga comes out of Hindu religious rituals. And so in terms of just the basic sort of exercise, that's one thing. But you have to understand that if you're going to a yoga class and if they're playing music or talking about anything, it's going to be that sort of subtext of this religious ritual that you are participating in. And what yoga is designed to do as well is not only in terms of the physical sort of application, but in sort of bringing you into a state and a meditative state to allow you to communicate with, you can describe them any way that you want, whether they're demons, they're the fallen angels, whether or not it's the ascended masters, whatever you want to call them. It's designed to put you in a state to be able to make that communication. And once you open yourself up to that, and then you are vulnerable, because you could just as easily be opening up a door to a demonic possession or some sort of demonic attacks that are going to nag you because you've opened up a door you shouldn't have opened up. So you want to be careful with it. The exercise part is, but if you're going into a location where they're doing all sorts of stuff that are, you would just look at it as cultural for that, understand that is where that religious ritual things start to come in, and try and separate yourself from anything to do with that sort of meditative ritual and keep it to an exercise basis. And I've not done any yoga, so I don't know exactly how you would separate that, but what I am definitely saying is you want to be very careful with this.
Right on. I know there are some places here in the South, in Georgia, that they've started playing worship music during their yoga sessions. So I guess they're trying to get as far detached from it and focus on the exercise part. But I like how you answered that. Thank you for that answer. And we'll move on to our last question. It's pretty short, but it definitely packs a punch. And I think that you discussed this once or twice before, but maybe we can re-clarify. James asks, is Satan just one individual, or is he a collection of chief rebel angels?
It's a good question. I'm not sure from which perspective that they're asking, but it gets asked from a few different angles. So in First Enoch, for example, which is apocryphal, but it does mention Satan, and it also mentions Satans in plural. We're talking about adversaries who report to the chief Satan, which is Hail El out of Isaiah 14:12. So you can use that title of a Satan as Satan's degraded status to adversary from where he fell as seraphim and cherubim and archangel. So he fell a long ways to this sort of Satan status. So is there more than one individual? As in two is like people like to separate Satan into. I get the argument, but typically the argument will come into that maybe one is more of a Nephilim type figure. As you take Hell back to the Hebrew meaning, there's a figurative allegory that comes out of it. Hell is spelled Hylel in English, and the figurative Helel is for a king of Babylon. So when you look at Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, you see things that look more like a human king, and then you've got aspects like being in around the throne of God, walking amongst the fiery stones, raising your throne up to God to be like God. They're talking about two different individuals. So understand that Hell is an allegory for the king of Babylon. Isaiah 14, it is a dual allegory, and you have a dual allegory in terms of how I define that is it has a component of important information out of prehistory. It has a prophecy that is going to happen shortly after Isaiah's time or during Isaiah's time, and it will also have some end time implications. And that's also why you have the Assyrian involved as you get on into about 1430 or so. And that's also why you have this in 1429, the serpent root that, is talked about in there as well. And also understand that Isaiah 14 is also part of Isaiah 13. It's as the full prophecy, and that's where you get more of the end time prophecy that's linking into the serpent's root. So it's a complex set of prophecies there, and I have a great breakdown on it for people who want. I'll walk you through in several part series of Isaiah, what I call Isaiah 14, the rest of the story. So we have to make sure that we don't confuse the allegorical individual for the king of Babylon, that would be the actual king of Babylon that is in the time of Jeremiah, and or the Assyrian that's in the time of Isaiah, which that they're talking about here as Hel figuratively as the king of Babylon. But we don't have a word that comes out of Helel for a king of Babylon anywhere else in the Bible. It's just an allegory for this type of king, both at that time and for the end time, just as we have Babylon in the end time. And so that's why it looks a bit confusing, is because it's talking about a prophecy for Isaiah's time in Isaiah 14, and then later, just as you have that in Ezekiel, and you also have the prehistory part about Satan, and then you have the end time implication that goes with that prophecy as well. So if you want that handout, get a hold of me. I'll send you the series on that.
All right, thank you for that answer. If I could, everyone that's joining, let's get a drum roll, please. We're getting ready to move into the speed round of questions. We have 15 minutes left, and we're going to be answering the live questions. So I do have a few questions already listed. If you have a question for Gary, please write it in all caps in the chat, and we'll just go ahead and get straight into it. The first one comes from the end, and they ask, how do you think the Nephilim are about to return?
Well, I think we've got the descendants with the bloodlines for sure. So we do know that they're going to be around in the end time and having influence in the power and the 10 King Nation Empire. And we get an indication of this in Daniel 2:43, where it talks about the descendants of the metallic empires that are created by the Nephilim shortly after the flood, and they create all of the dynasties in the post-Diluvian epoch that we're currently in, and all the royal families for the most part thereafter. They will actually mix their seed with the seed of humans. So I think because we have those descendants, that's part of it. But it also opens up the door to possibly that there could be Nephilim that are going to mix their seed with humans in the end time as well. So are we actually going?
Oh, we're losing Gary. Let me try to give him a call back. I think maybe somebody didn't like this information. So please stand by. Oh, Gary, I think I see you again. Are you still there?
Yeah, I did not lose you. I could hear you all the way through. So.
Really? The video went black and then
Okay.
it froze up. So it's still frozen a little bit on the video side of things, but I can hear you now.
Okay.
So
Okay.
why don't we'll go ahead and
do you want
get
to
off the
reconnect,
video and we can just use the voice. It's fine.
Okay.
All right. So you were in the middle of talking about the Nephilim returning.
Yeah, so I have to be open, as in, it's going to be like the days of Noah. So I have to be open to the fact that we're going to have Nephilim show up some way, somehow, perhaps even over and above who the descendants are. And so, with the technology and advancement that we're moving towards, and also with, I think, that knowledge being accelerated as it was in the days of Noah by the fallen angels who aren't in the abyss yet, I think there's a possibility for another incursion where they could create these giants again, which would be probably more similar to the Rephaim that show up after the flood as opposed to the Nephilim, which are before the flood. Or we could create our own Nephilim type of creatures through DNA type of manipulation and create Nephilim that way. And also need to be open to the fact that maybe somehow they survived in the earth, off the earth, in stasis, hiding in mountains, in different dimensions, whatever, because this whole concept of the days that are going to be like Noah, I think we have to be open to the idea so that we don't get deceived as to what is actually going to go on in the end time, and we shouldn't be caught off guard. So I think we should be open to that fact. What I do know is that even in the New Testament, you get a lot of references to the great and mighty men, and you also have Gibborim that are showing up in some of the battles towards the time of the end time in Joel 1 through 4. It's going to show up twice. You also have Gibborim showing up as the Hebrew word for mighty ones in the Gog War. So I think, again, we have to be careful because Gibborim doesn't always mean giant. But it does in a lot of applications, that we need to be open to the idea that we're going to see things that we thought we weren't, 20 or 30 years ago or 40 years ago or before, we wouldn't have thought that we would see. So I think we need to be open to that.
Amen. Thank you for that. All right, the next question comes from MJM. How did the Aryan race factor into Nazi Germany religion? Did they believe that the pre-flood giants were only temporarily defeated and will be restored and rise again?
Yeah, it's I have a whole chapter in my book devoted to this where I go into it in great detail. You have to understand that the creation of the Nazis is a joint effort by secret societies with many different orders, like the German Orden and the Thule Society, which Thule is sort of a Norse version of Atlantis, and that they believe Aryans descended from Thule are part of the organizations that created the Nazis, along with Theosophy, which is a religion that is created by the Gnostics and the Rosicrucians, because it's the religion of the Rosicrucians, to create this religion that is going to be a bridge between science and religion for the end time, which is also where New Age comes from, is out of Theosophy and Gnosticism. And this is the religion that the Nazis adopt, but they call it Ariosophy. And so they take it to a different sort of perversion designed for their Volkish ideology, where they overlay their Norse ideology onto Grail and onto the Bible and onto Theosophy. So it's sort of a conglomeration on that. But in short, they actually believe that the blonde hair, blue-eyed people via the Tuatha Danann were the descendants coming out of the flood who survived the flood and who escaped Tartarus. And in Atlantean versions and polytheism, you have red hair, hazel-eyed versions like the ones that went into Romania and who Prince Charles, as I mentioned earlier in the show, takes his bloodlines back through via Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, and also those the red-haired and hazel-eyed ones also went to Ireland and to Wales as of the Tuatha De Danann. So two different strains, and so they believe they're from the blonde-haired, blue-eyed version that went north into Russia and into Germany and into Norway. And again, that's where the Sinclair bloodline takes their bloodline back. So yes, they actually believe they are direct descendants and that there's something in the blood that if they could have backward engineered, they could have created new Nephilim. And so when you look at the new man concept, that's what they were trying to do, was create the new Nephilim. And I think the Nazi religion and goals and total analogy is I'll get the word out, is a good analogy for what the end time is going to look like, complete with Hitler as a Messiah type of individual. And this concept of this backward engineering of the blood comes from the real concept, which again takes this whole ideology back to the bloodlines of the Nephilim, which are generally the royal bloodlines, and that this real concept is the concept that comes out of the Rosicrucians that now enters into Nazism. So you have to understand that all of these things are always working in our world to create the end time. It's just that it can't happen until the ordained times. So to get more detail on it, I suggest you buy my book or get a hold of me and I can send you some more information on it.
Right on. Thank you very much. All right, the next question comes from Chris. If Satan is the great counterfeiter, do you believe there must be a fake Jesus in the end times? Esau, the prophet of Jesus, or the prophet Jesus of Islam, maybe a false prophet like a lamb that spoke as a dragon?
Yeah, that's exactly what they're talking about there is you have, a false prophet who is separate from Antichrist, but he's the one like Elijah who makes the way for Antichrist, who's the false Messiah. And so this false prophet is going to be, the one who has two horns like a lamb and speaks like the dragon. And it's going to be the one that takes over the religion that is being set up for the universal religion. So I kind of tend to fall on the side that it's going to be this universal church that's being worked around Rome, and I don't believe Pope Francis is the false prophet. I think it's too early and there's still too much to do and he's too old. But one who will come after Francis is going to totally turn that universal church, as Catholicism is already defined as, and is sitting on seven hills, and understand that Babylon, used by Peter and in the New Testament, is an allegory for Rome as a Pesher code, is going to be where this religion is going to be centered. So I do believe there will be a false prophet that is like Elijah, that is like John, and is going to be part of that whole counterfeit, because all of that has to be in place to do everything that Jesus said he would do to deceive people, and particularly the elect.
All right, thank you for that answer. I think we have time for maybe one more question. This one comes from Zach. What is your input on the Holy Spirit being the feminine aspect of the Godhead?
Yeah, and in Proverbs, we actually get the Holy Spirit using um, a female pronoun, as in she, as in her, in the English translation. So, but understand that these are earthly, physical world terms. And we want to be very careful, and I don't think this is the spirit for the question, but we have to be careful that we don't cross over in this understanding of the Holy Spirit to equate that with a mother goddess that would be in polytheism, because that's what the Gnostics do. So we want to be very, very careful on how we address that, but we have to also address that the pronouns are there. Just as you get male pronouns for the word of God in Proverbs, and obviously male pronoun for God. But I also don't think that God is a particular sex. He's a spirit, and he's omnipotent. So I think we have to also separate earthly terms, earthly understanding, with heavenly terms, heavenly reality, and what is going on with the types of beings in heaven. It doesn't mean that there may not be different sort of versions, but there's no need for sex when you're in the age of immortality, just as Matthew 25 talks about, or Matthew talks about, with no marriage in heaven. But typically, if you're a spirit being, there's really no need for any of that sort of physical sort of division of our physical body so that we can recreate. So I would say I can't deny that there is that female pronoun used in Proverbs, but I would not take that too far. That would be my caution.
Right on. All right, thank you very much for that one. We still have 3 minutes. I think we can fit this next question in, since it is the speed round. John asked, could Nephilim survive the flood as mermaids or some aquatic hybrid? That's a cool question.
That's a good one. There could have been, maybe there was some violations that made Nephilim type of mermaids, right? Mermen. What's interesting is in First Enoch, it talks about the original mothers who create the Nephilim are thereafter degraded or sentenced to being sirens. And sirens are, you go back into Sumerian and Greek mythology, are virtually the same as mermaids. So thinking that's a little bit different line of thought in terms of how mermaids come about as a mythology. That's not really directly related to the Nephilim, but it is back in that same sort of period where there is a connection. But I'm not thinking that they survived as Aquaman part fish type of thing as what we saw in the movie. But again, we don't know all the different types of Nephilim that were out there at that time. So who knows? Maybe they're telling us what's going to happen in advance again, and using like Aquaman as part of that, hiding everything in plain sight sort of thing that the secret societies and the polytheist world likes to do. So hard to know. I'm thinking not, but again, have to be open to the possibilities based on everything that is what we know about polytheism and their account of prehistory, and then how they roll that forward and what they're trying to do today. So, but I'm thinking probably not, though.
All right, thank you so much for all of the questions that you have all submitted, and thank you so much, Gary, for all of the answers and the knowledge that you've shared with us today. I'm just always humbled by the amount of information that gets put into my mind every time we sit down for these shows. 12 ounce pound said thank you again for your time, Gary, and Flat Earth said this was a great show. Always enjoy your work, from Basil Smith. We're really, I just had a great time. And yeah, could you please just let everyone know one last time where they could go and get your book?
Yes. So best place to go find my book, particularly if you want a signed copy, is go to the Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on there I also have an email. So if there's some information on some of the documents that I talked about tonight, mention the document by name and or subject, and I'll send you that document. And you can also link over to barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com and amazon.ca, and link into the Kindle version if you want a digital format. So that's the best and quickest way, or you can go directly to those sites. And if your local bookstore doesn't have it on the shelf and you really want to support them, they can order it in. It's distributed by Bookmasters. So then they'll be familiar with who Bookmasters are.
Awesome. We appreciate it. And we got plenty of people here. Chris, my beloved, Brandon, thank you everybody for your kind words. Donna said that she's going to ask her local library to get your book. So that would be awesome. Definitely definitely to get your book in plenty of libraries.
Well, and that's the thing with libraries is that, if you request a book and, if you want a book and they don't have it and you request it, they're obligated to order the book in.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way to help us out if you want to go ahead and request our books in your local library. But thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Gary, for joining us. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to everybody's question, but for everybody who did submit a question in the live chat, I do have them on the list, and I will throw them on the list for the next episode of Ask Me Anything with Gary Wayne. So, Gary, do you mind closing us out in a prayer?
Sure. Father in heaven, thank you for providing us this opportunity and these gateways to congregate in ways, we wouldn't have even imagined of being able to do many, even a decade and a half or so ago. And these formats are so helpful to allow us to congregate and to encourage worship of you and to encourage the glorifying of your name, and to dig deeper into scriptures and to help your faithful and all of us to put on the armor of God so that we can go spread your word and be more confident and give more detail and to plant more seeds, so that even if people aren't ready yet to hear your word, as they see these things for what is going to happen in the future come to pass, that it will start to ring a bell and they'll come back to you. And if we can save one person by learning more and then spreading what we learn, then everything that we do is worthwhile. But we do it not for our glory, but for your glory, and that your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so we want to bless everybody who participated tonight, and hopefully we edified them in some more knowledge. And we thank you for this opportunity to be able to do that. And we pray these things in the name of our Savior, the Word Jesus, who sits at your right hand side and testifies to you for us and for all of the saints, and also in the Holy Spirit, in your great and holy name. Amen.
Amen. Hallelujah. Gary, when you were young, did you ever put a string and attach it between two paper cups and then go in like one room and your friend go in the other room, and then you can talk to the cup and it will carry your voice?
Yep.
That's what the internet feels like, right? We've evolved into this magnificent paper cup string system, and now we can fellowship with people all over the world. It's so awesome. But
exactly. Yeah, it's a great opportunity.
Definitely. And we can even cross international lines.
Yes.
Yep. We appreciate you, Gary. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.